Stas Zvinyatskovsky.
Hi everybody, I'm Stas Zvinyatskovsky. I'm a managing director at Accenture. Accenture is a global consulting company, and so I work with Fortune 500 type of companies to help them with software engineering, modern software engineering. I'm very honored and humbled to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for accepting my talk. Always wanted to visit Latvia. I grew up not far from here, relatively, like in Ukraine. And so today I was just walking around, just practicing for my talk, and it reminded me of Kiev in a lot of ways, so feels like coming home. So thank you. How many of you have been to New York? Okay, a lot of you. And I'm sure even if if you've never been to New York, you recognize the classic kind of New York picture, classic New York taxi cab. But how many of you know that the number of taxi cabs on the street of New York is limited? There's a certain number of permits that gets allocated to people, and it stays fixed over the years. And so the supply stays the same, demand keeps on increasing over the years. What happens? The price goes up, right? And so for many years, it was one of the best investments that you can make. You could buy, they call them medallions. So you can buy a taxi cab medallion, and it just like sell it 5-10 years later, you'll make a lot of money. And so in 2015, 3 years ago, the price for the medallion reached an all-time high, $1.32 million in July of 2015. But then something happened. Uber happened, right? And 2 years later, in August of 2017, so all of this is public information, I looked it up. In August of 2017, the price dropped to $150,000. That's an 89% drop in just 2 years. And if you go and look at the statistics, you actually see that these are not sales, these are foreclosures. So people declaring bankruptcies because they lost all of their money. And I read this sad story about this one person who actually invested all of his money into medallions, lost all of his money, made some bad decisions, ended up going to jail. Well, so that's the impact of disruption. And we were all familiar with Uber and the impact that it had on taxi industry and car rental industry. But it's not limited to just those industries. There's a lot of statistics that you can pull up, and this is one of them. This is kind of a well-known chart. Lifespan of companies is just getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And so you have an average lifespan of an S&P 500 company in the 80s, somewhere around 35 years. And now it's under 20, and pretty soon it's going to be at 15 years old. That's just incredible. Companies just don't live that long anymore. Another famous example, and this is, you might not be familiar with the companies, but this was to anybody who was paying attention to statistics, they've known that disruption is happening and the companies are not living as long. But for a lot of CEOs and a lot of boards of directors, this was the wake-up call, and this happened about 2010, so like about 10 years ago. So Blockbuster in the 90s was just this thriving company in the United States. You remember how we used to watch movies in the 90s on these cassette tapes, right? And so they would rent out cassette tapes because you can, it wasn't easy to get one, or you had to pay money to buy one. So every day people would go, whenever they want to watch a movie, they would go to a Blockbuster. They were in every corner. You can rent a movie, and then a couple days later you return it. Thriving business everywhere, huge client base, dead in something like 8 years, right? Netflix showed up and just destroyed them. And you can actually gain a lot of insights from this graph. Like, how is it that this upstart company destroyed an established company with $6 billion of revenue, established client base, good brand? And it's not that they didn't see them coming. Well, first of all, they actually had 2 opportunities to buy them early on, but they declined. But then later on, people were saying, hey, Netflix they're just going to destroy this business. They're going to destroy Blockbuster. And they had 6 years to react before this precipitous drop happened. And they couldn't. They tried. They tried in many ways, but they just failed. They didn't have the ammunition to fight that fight. And so they went down in flames. And this is on the mind of every CEO, every CTO, CIO that I work with, right? They get this, but they have trouble delivering. They have trouble moving as fast. they have trouble understanding how they can respond to disruption. And so we'll talk about the response to disruption today. But let's first look at what is causing the disruption. Why is disruption happening? And so what we know from history is that disruption is typically associated with a new technology being introduced, going back to, from Stone Age to Bronze Age to Iron Age, etc., to Industrial Age. And if you just look at the computer age, right, it started with mainframes, then we got into PCs, the Internet 1.0, Web 2.0, mobile, etc., and more waves are coming. And what's interesting is these waves are coming much, much faster with higher frequency now. And so you see new companies appearing with each one of these waves. The Internet 1.0, it was the companies that are now, some of them don't exist or they are not as prominent, Yahoo and eBay. And then you have Web 2.0 companies, Facebook, and then you have mobile companies. Some of them managed to reinvent themselves. Facebook is a true mobile company now, even though that's not how they started. Even PayPal from Web 1.0 days is now reinventing themselves as a mobile company, right? So as new technology comes in, new companies take advantage of new technologies. The second factor is logarithmic reduction in the cost of technology. And we all know about the cost of CPU and the cost of storage, etc., etc. One of the most dramatic examples is the cost of sequencing a human genome. In the 90s, when it was first done, it cost several $billion to perform just one sequencing. And today, it costs, what, like $70? Like any one of us can do it. I've done mine. It's fun. It's very easy to do. And so you have new technologies coming in at lower cost, and then also they are available to anybody. Just a couple of years ago, if you take some of the newer technologies, deep learning, there was only a few companies that could utilize deep learning. Your Google, your Facebook, your Microsoft. But thanks to all the cloud providers, anybody in the world has very easy access to deep learning or any technology really. As soon as it shows up, it becomes available on the cloud. Right? And the investment is zero, right? There's no capital cost, right? Just start innovating. So you have you can have people sitting anywhere in any coffee shop, anywhere in the world, on Monday dreaming up an idea, and by Friday they're competing with established companies that have been around for decades or even centuries. And so, faced with these factors, right? So these are the factors that are causing disruption. Established companies, they can kind of emulate that behavior. They see the new technologies coming in, they can utilize cloud, they can do all the same things that startups are doing. But then startups are doing something that established companies have really hard time emulating. And that is speed, right? They're moving super fast. And at first, for a long time, there was a little bit of that condescending view of, okay, these companies are moving fast, but they don't have any clients, or they don't care about quality. And it's true to a large extent with a lot of startups, that's what's happening. But then you have these billion-dollar companies now, multi-billion-dollar companies now, that have started like that, and they have not lost their speed. And Amazon is releasing to production thousands and thousands and thousands of times a day. So if you're going to compete with Amazon, people call it the Bezos roulette. Jeff Bezos wakes up one day and decides to go into pharmaceuticals. And you better be able to match their speed. And this is where companies struggle the most, right? This is what they've tried, just like Blockbuster, they try to emulate the speed and they can't. And so that is the focus of today's presentation. How can established companies match the speed of startups, or just the speed that we have all heard about throughout the presentations yesterday and today? And so to understand what's holding them back, we need to look at the history of processes. And we really need to go back to the industrial age, right? So industrial age was kicked off actually in the early 18th century with the invention of steam engine. But it really didn't go into full strength until the late 19th century, or second half of the 19th century. And that's when it just came roaring in. And so, second half of the 19th century, we started seeing these mass manufacturing plants, factories, right? And back then, this will sound familiar, we did not know how to operate those factories, right? We did not have the proper processes, or rather, we had a lot of different choices. And in the society, there were conversations. There were a lot of conversations about how to best organize factories. And eventually, this point of view won the day, and the thought leader behind it was Frederick Taylor. You should all know him. How many of you know of Taylor? Quite a few. Right, so this is the person who gave you your manager, so thank him. So there were a lot of conversations happening in the world at that time, and really it's primarily between Europe and North America. And the conversations were, how do you organize an enterprise? And the point of view that these folks, this was the efficiency movement, right? These folks came in with a point of view that your enterprise needs to be organized around efficiency. That should be your North Star. And Taylor's approach was very straightforward, right? Measure, what a novel idea. And the two primary measurements are time and cost. And if you have time and cost, you know your efficiency. So now you optimize your entire enterprise for efficiency. The way to achieve that, you create two classes of people in the enterprise. You create workers and you create managers. And you create a hierarchy so that you can have command and control and decisions rolling down to workers. Right? And then he also said, once you do this, you can plan ahead. So that's kind of the origins of supply chain optimization. So that's the efficiency movement, and that's the approach to organizing factories and enterprise around efficiency. And to me, hierarchy is kind of the symbol of that efficiency movement and the approach to organizing enterprises that way. And it took off like a storm. Right. Those were the only enterprises that survived. So starting early 20th century, if you didn't orient yourself towards efficiency, you were dead. Right? And so the entire world is now pretty much organized around efficiencies. Any factories anywhere in the world. Right? There were some modifications to the method that were done in the 1950s and the 60s in Japan, but primarily everybody is organized around efficiency in the manufacturing world. And so now we get into the 1950s. Right, and computer age is just starting. And of course, we just naturally, we adopted the same exact processes because we knew the processes and we thought that they would work. And they did. And they did for 30, 40 years. Took us into the 90s, took us into the PC era. But then something happened. And in the 90s, the internet happened. And the question is, how does the internet impact our industrial processes? Well, so go back to the 80s. How did we ship software back in the 80s? CDs. Any other? Diskettes. Found this picture online. This is actually my story. I found an old floppy and I showed it to my son. He's 12 years old. I said, "Do you know what this is?" He goes, "Yeah, that's a compact disc." I'm like, "Yeah." Anyway, so if you ship on floppies or CDs, how many times can you ship a year? Maybe once or twice, right? And so naturally your transaction cost is super high. And so naturally your batch size increases. I remember when I was an intern, my first project, we coded for 18 months. Of course, I showed up, they just started. I left, they were still coded for another year after I left, right? So the batch sizes were just enormous back then. But then the internet happened. And full disclosure, I used to work at Yahoo. I spent many years at Yahoo. And so when the internet happened, you have your production code running. And you can go to a production server, and you can change the code right there. I would never do that, of course. But you could do it right there, and your users experience that new functionality immediately. So your transaction cost is 0, which enables batch size of 1 character, 1 byte, if you will. Right? And that theoretically enables companies to move a lot faster and a lot more efficient. And so the original approach to industrial processes started showing its limitations. So we quickly figured out that it works really well if you know exactly what it is that you're building. If you're building a car, you need to know 2 years in advance or 3 years in advance. It really doesn't work if you're ambiguous about what it is that you're doing or you're still experimenting. Right? And the second limitation was fundamental limitations of speed. And actually, you don't need to be theoretical about it. You can just go to empirical data of the last 20, 25 years, because there are companies still are trying to retain their hierarchy and move fast to this day. Right? And those companies are failing in this. Right? They can launch maybe 4 times a year. That's the limit. Of course, if your organization is smaller, maybe you can do monthly releases. But that's about it. The hierarchy is ultimately holding you back. Right? And so what's wrong with that, right? And what we found out over the last couple of decades is that the cost of delay in today's world sometimes outweighs the cost of efficiency. It's a very financial calculation, right? So in the old days, if you have a better car and you release it 6 months later than a competitor or a year later than a competitor, you might still win in the marketplace because you have a better product. So the cost of delay is small. But imagine if Instagram launched a year later or even a month later, they might have lost the opportunity, right? So the opportunity cost, the cost of delay is just enormous in many cases today. And we're finding more and more situations where cost of delay far outweighs the cost of inefficiency. And I love this quote by the founder of the World Economic Forum. In the new world, it's not the big fish that eats the small fish, it's the fast fish that eats the slow fish. And so we need a new process, a process that is focused towards speed. We mentioned the original process that was focused on efficiency. There was some work done in the 50s and the 60s to focus us more towards quality. We need a new process, the new process that is oriented towards speed. Hint, it's not just DevOps. There's more to it. And I've identified 8 elements of that process, and we'll go through them. Of course, I do a whole separate presentation just on this process, right? But we'll go through them fast. And these 8 elements are ultimately the ingredients that are required for companies to start moving fast and dealing with the disruption that they're experiencing. And so the first element is decentralization. To put it simply, if you have an organization of 1,000 people, it'll never move fast. Right? Just because of coordination required, human coordination required, you will be slow. And so, Taylor said you can approach it through a hierarchy. That's how you organize. We know hierarchy that only gets you so far. So if you want to maintain the highest possible speed, the highest possible productivity, there are limits to your organizational units. And through a lot of empirical research, we know that for an individual team, it's 4 to 7 people per team. After that, productivity starts dropping. Out of those teams, you assemble organizations. Organizations also have a limitation, right? There is a often quoted Dunbar number of 150 people. That's where you have, after which the group cohesion starts dropping. And the group cohesion is the psychological concept of group acting towards a common goal. Right? Typically everybody knows each other, kind of likes each other, they can act together. My experience, my personal experience, and I've been thinking about it for about 10 years and collecting data, my personal experience for software engineering, the size of that group cannot exceed 50 people. After that, you see this in startups. You go to a startup, if they're a successful startup, they grow beyond 50 people, old processes start to break down. And so you need to decentralize, and you kind of need to loosely align those organizational units. So we are, in a sense, if you think about it, we're applying a theory of constraints to a software engineering process. What's holding us back? First, it's the coupling. It's coupling, so you need to decouple. And to enable that, you need to physically decouple, right? You need the architecture that allows these organizational units to operate independently of each other. So these are I used to call this the pull-apartable architecture, right? The decoupled architecture. So microservices architecture is decoupleable, right? Decoupled architecture. Reactive architecture is decoupled architecture. Any architecture that enables units to operate independently of each other is the architecture that we're going after. And by the way, here the bottom row is going to be mostly mechanical enablers, whereas the top row is processes and operating model. Applying the theory of constraints, again, what's the next thing that's holding us back? Why are we slow? The second thing is software delivery pipelines are slow, because we have humans operating in those pipelines. Humans are unreliable, humans are slow. So if somehow you can manage to start developing faster, pipeline becomes your bottleneck, right? And you either lose on quality, which often happens, or you lose on speed. Right? And so the only way around it is to automate the pipeline. We just heard a great presentation by Neil where they eliminated all human activity after the check-in. And their latency is in minutes from commit to production. The best companies out there operate like that, right? And so if you want to compete with those companies, you have to match that speed. The next 2 elements are they work together because we want, again, Deming had an excellent quote about not being able to assert quality after the fact. It has to be built in. And we want to utilize engineering excellence practices, unit testing, test-driven development, behavioral-driven development, all of that good stuff. It needs to be done as the code is developed. But it's really hard to do unless you have blended teams. And so let's talk about blended teams. So in the old days, we used to have business analysts, developers, release engineers, testers, operations people. Right, and when this happens, when you throw stuff over the wall, well, first of all, it's slow and you need to coordinate a lot. But then it creates this psychological situation of, and actually let's economists first describe it, it's called moral hazard. When I don't feel the pain, I will incur more risk, naturally, right? And so if I'm coding and I'm throwing it over the wall and it goes to production 6 months down the line, I will not feel that pain. Operations people will feel the pain. Maybe testers will feel the pain. But because of that, I will incur more risk. And it's not because I'm immoral. It's because there's so much pressure applied to developers nowadays because of that disruption again. And so we want to create cross-functional teams where a team is fully capable of developing and delivering software with all of the capabilities on the team. Ideally, we want everybody on the team to have the same set of skills. That would be ideal, right? Those are blended teams. So the next set of elements is around how structuring your product process, right? So yes, you want to orient towards value, but the question is, if you have these decentralized operating units, what do you orient them towards? Towards components, towards features, and the best teams out there, the best companies out there, orient them towards specific customers or customer segments. Or better yet, so Lyft is a company that competes with Uber. They are quite vocal about it. They organize these units by customer journeys. So those are even smaller units. So an example of a customer journey is account sign up or a driver on their way home, right? That would be a customer journey. And so they create super small decentralized units, and they operate independently of each other, completely responsible for one full journey. And you have to have the bottom components in order to enable that. And so these 7 elements allow you to churn out features really fast. And where a lot of companies fail is this last piece. And it's this idea of learning. After you deliver features, measuring and learning and taking that measurement back into the system. Right, so it's been popularized recently with lean startup, build, measure, learn. It goes back to Deming's cycle and even further in history. So these are the 8 elements. And if you utilize these 8 elements, you will see higher level of productivity, speed, quality, and by the way, you have much happier employees. And so this ultimately, why is that good? This ultimately enables business agility. Because business agility is the ability to respond to market challenges and take advantage of market opportunities. And so now we get into a transformation. How do you get that? And I don't use the word transformation lightly. By definition, it's a thorough change in form. And it's really hard, right? You have to reinvent your culture. Like your cultural norms are changing, your values are changing. It's not for the faint of heart, especially since most of your managers have grown up and succeeded in the old culture, and they need to reinvent themselves. And so the first question is always, what is your objective? Like, we have situations where a lot of companies, they just go, they have a separate testing department, and they're being squeezed because developers have figured out how to move faster, and the quality is dropping because these guys can't keep up. So their objective is quality. We have people so my favorite example of the last couple of years, a CFO of this big European company comes to the CIO and says, 3 years from now, your cost is going to be your budget is going to be 50% of what it is today. Figure it out, right? And so they need to implement these levers that we talked about today to improve their productivity. A lot of companies are trying to move faster, right? They're motivated by moving faster. And then there is a subset of that hyperspeed people. This is one CIO of one company told me, I want to be faster than Facebook. Well, you can be, but do you have what it takes to be faster than Facebook? Are you willing to invest and make the necessary changes? And so I've identified 5 approaches that companies take to transformation. I did not invent any of this. This is just, I observed this, right? And I documented what they're doing and the impact that they're seeing. And of course, it's very nuanced in reality. These are very broad brush strokes. And so remember, what companies are doing, they're utilizing the levers at the bottom to ultimately affect the outcomes on the top. And so let's go through these. There's 5 of them. The first one, I already mentioned, testing automation. Typically, the situation is testing department still exists, a separate department. Quality is dropping because developers are moving faster, and these guys can't keep up, right? And so they realize they need to automate, or maybe they're seeing the writing on the wall that that department is not going to be there for long. And so they automate, and it actually works. It improves your operating costs significantly, 20–30% improvements in operating costs easily, just by automating testing. Doesn't help with quality at all, because it wasn't really built in. The second approach is, we've seen this now for what, 10–15 years, people doing agile transformations. When you go into the company and company is talking about a transformation and you don't see engineers in the room, it's all product managers, or sorry, program managers, you know they're probably attempting to do agile transformation. And you know, the truth is that at the it doesn't improve things really. But people are somehow feel a little bit happier, so it creates a better environment, but there's no impact on the company's bottom line. And we've been doing this for 10–15 years because we did not have the ability to automate software delivery until, what, 5–7 years ago? Right, so that's how we started, but now we know better. And so there is also the opposite approach, where you come in and it's only engineers. And all they're trying to do is automate their software delivery. And this is a good stepping stone. This is a good way to start, right? Because the impact is quite profound, right? Quality improves, speed improves, productivity improves, people are happier. Of course, if you're not utilizing any of the agile processes or lean processes or value-oriented processes in general, then what are you working on? But you have the ability to move fast, okay, good. So finally, this is probably the most popular approach that people go for, and that's the engineering transformation. So it's the 2 previous ones put together, right? But people here are still maintaining some level of manual intervention. For software delivery, for testing, there's a little bit of testing that's done manually. Push button typically approaches to software delivery. Some companies attempt to utilize some agile scaling frameworks with this. And the impact is really good. And for many companies, this is as far as they're going to go, because they're not willing to let go of that manual mentality. And finally, there's this big nirvana that everybody talks about, is the business agility transformation, where you break up your org, decentralize everything, change the operating model, change roles and responsibilities, change your architecture, automate to the point that there's no manual intervention. That's faster than Facebook. That's what we're talking about. However, the disruption is enormous, and a lot of companies don't have what it takes to go through that disruption. So these are all of the approaches summarized. Pick your poison. Pick the one that appeals most to you, applies better to your situation. But of course, and you know, everybody wants all of these things to go up. And maybe that's your initial goal. But if you're not willing to modify, to use the right levers, you're not ready for the disruption, then maybe you should reset your expectations. And so another chart, this is of course, transformations 4 and 5 have much bigger business impact than the previous ones. And so as you get into the execution, so how do you actually make it happen? This looks very waterfallish, right? Plan, execute. But what I mean by this is think before you do, right? Spend that week or 2 weeks or maybe even 2 months or 6 months, whatever it takes. Come up with the vision. Come up with the necessary guiding principles. Then start executing. And by the way, it's a cultural change, so execute it as a cultural change. Make the necessary investment in infrastructure. Train people, right? That's just essential. And then, as you're exercising, you're always trying to balance speed and quality. 2–3 years ago, most companies were trying to do this in a very kind of gradual fashion. Take a couple of teams, transform them, then another couple of teams, learn more teams. Takes several years. Nowadays, everybody's under such tremendous pressure. They're trying to get through it in a year or year and a half, right? So they're just like going all out, just rolling it out. And so that's the talk. Again, I thank you for coming. Thank you for listening to me. Just to summarize, continuous disruption is driving the need for business agility and for speed. Modern engineering process is the way to get there. There are multiple approaches to choose from. Pick the one that most applies to you. Live long and prosper. Thank you.
And if there is one really good question, there is one good question. Okay.
It's the best question.
How people usually, let's say, measure and evaluate business agility?
It's very hard. I don't think we have figured it out. So even a lot of these metrics that I showed in the middle, even they are hard to measure. But so ultimately, business agility, the simplest, the crudest method is your revenue, right? So that's the outcome. If you're succeeding, if your revenue is growing, profitability is growing, you know you're doing something right. Yeah, absolutely. So it's tough. I don't think we have figured it out. Right. Thank you. Of course, I'll be around.
Thank you, Stas.
Yep. Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.